The government of God is not despotic, but fatherly. It doesn't say, don't reason but obey, rather, reason diligently, so that out of your own conviction you can voluntarily and fearlessly demonstrate reverence for God, which would be of no value at all if it was coerced. With him who believes slavishly, and precisely for that reason compels others to disface tyrannically, nothing can be done. Whoever has love for peace does not get into rational arguments with him. Immanuel Kant. While I start all my Kant lectures with a quote, I usually let the quote stand for itself and don't comment on it. Or, you could say that the lecture following the quote is the comment and the explanation of the quote. But in this case, I do want to mention that this quote of Kant's makes me think of something the Quran says, which Kant himself, of course, couldn't have been aware. He didn't read the Quran. But the Quran says, "There shall be no coercion in matters of faith. Distinct has now become the right way from the way of error. Hence, he who rejects the powers of evil and believes in God has indeed taken hold of a support most unfailing, which shall never give way. For God is all-hearing, all-knowing. God is near unto those who have faith, taking them out of deep darkness into the light. Whereas near unto those who are bent on denying the truth are the powers of evil, that take them out of the light into darkness deep. It is they who are destined for the fire, therein to abide." In my previous lecture, I have explained that to Kant there's a difference between theology and religion. Theology is theoretical. Your theology is what you believe about God. Do you believe there is a God? Do you believe there are many gods? Do you believe God is a trinity or not? And so on and so on and so on. And your religion is how you act. Religion is practical. And I said that when it comes to theology, Kant, and not only Kant, that's a classical, well-known distinction, Kant distinguishes between revealed theology and rational theology. Revealed theology is based on some sort of divine revelation. God showed himself through miracles or visions or prophets or whatever. And now the task of this theology is to interpret this revelation, to understand God based on how he revealed himself to us. In rational theology, on the other hand, you are not basing your insights of God on revelation, but on your own reason. You think about God. And it is this rational theology in particular, which is the task of the philosopher, but also in a way which is the task of every person, even the common person, which does not need formal learning, which does not require you to be a scholar who can read, let's say, ancient languages like Greek or Hebrew or Arabic or Sanskrit to understand some revelation. It only requires you to think critically. And since religion is a matter for everyone, since the question is there God and what does he want of us, concerns all human beings, rational theology must be possible for everyone, Kant believes. I also talked in the previous lecture about the relationship between the two, which constitutes what Kant would call the conflict between the philosophical and the theological faculty. Some people claiming that you can know God only through revelation and wanting to use your own reason to know God is blasphemy. Others claiming that all revelation, all miracles, all prophecies, and so on, that's all nonsense and superstition. And if at all, then you would have to know God through your reason. With Kant himself saying that there is a place for both, that there might be revelation that gives us extra information, so to say, about God that our reason could never find. And that might also historically even come first, because while people in theory could use their reason to understand God, maybe they will not do so without first God revealing himself and thereby pointing their reason in the right direction. But still, to Kant, the rational theology must form the fundament even of the revealed theology, because otherwise, how would you even know if a supposed revelation is true at all? And even if it is true, how would you know how to interpret it? You need something outside of the revelation to judge the revelation, and that can only be your own reason. And that is why I want to now get into what Kant has to say about rational theology. And here we are, well, immediately confronted with a problem. And that is, if we want to think about God and to understand God, well, God is the absolute. God is unlimited, infinite, and eternal. And we are limited beings. So it should not even be possible for us to grasp God. And whatever we are thinking, all the concepts we could have, either come out of our own intellect or they come out of our experience that we make in this world. In both cases, these concepts of ours are limited and far below whatever God might be. So there's the issue that it seems to not even possible for us to grasp God. And this is particularly an issue because it might lead to anthropomorphism, Kant says, which of course means, right, in Greek, anthropos is the human being, and morphos like the form, so giving something a human form, human attributes, right? Like when you have some story with talking animals that we are closest and so on, then they are anthropomorphic animals. And likewise, you might be tempted or almost required by your thinking to think of any rational being, and therefore also of God, in human terms, because these are the only terms we know. And so you might be tempted to anthropomorphize God. And this is a huge problem because Kant is convinced that it completely ruins religion. Indeed, he says anthropomorphism in our imagination of God is worse for religion than actual atheism is. It's better to not believe in a God at all than to believe in a God who really is just a very powerful human being, because you will, at the end of the day, you will just end up believing in some heavenly tyrant sitting up there on the clouds and demanding that you do or don't do that, and cowering in fear of him. And when it comes to this anthropomorphism, Kant distinguishes two kinds. He says there's crude and there's subtle anthropomorphism. Now, the crude anthropomorphism imagines God as human-like, even physically. So it imagines God as having a human-like form, like the gods of old, the gods of polytheism, right? That walk and talk around, that eat, that have sex with one another or with human beings. And this, however, is something that is not limited to the old pagan faiths. This is not limited to polytheism. You will find something like this even in monotheism, even in the Abrahamic faiths, right? Think, for example, of the Mosian Macabre mysticism, where you have these visions of Jewish sages that saw God, that stood in front of God's throne, and God is sitting on his throne, and God is in the image of an old man. And then you have imagery like angels coming and actually measuring God, measuring how long are God's arms, how long are his legs, how long is his beard, what's the distance between his eyes, even what is the distance between the holes in his nose. And this, of course, is a very, very anthropomorphic image of God. Of course, it's mysticism, you don't have to take it literally. But nevertheless, God here is imagined as an old man. Or likewise, in Mohammedan theology, in the Middle Ages, there were these disputes because sometimes, for example, the Quran talks of the hand of God, right? Saying that God holds the power in his hand, or that God made a human being with his two hands. And there were people that actually said we have to take this literally, right? There were discussions. Is this a metaphor? Or should we really, since the Quran is the word of God and we have no right to interpret it, should we really take it as at face value and say, okay, so God made the human being with his literal hands? So even in the monotheistic Abrahamic faiths, you can get this crude anthropomorphism. However, Kant says this one is actually the less dangerous sort of anthropomorphism, precisely because it is more crude, because it is more obvious. What is more dangerous is the subtle anthropomorphism. And here you anthropomorphize God less physically. You don't necessarily imagine him as having a human-like body, but you anthropomorphize him psychologically. You still imagine him as having somewhat of a human psyche, right? When you talk about the wrath of God, or about God being a jealous God, or about God hating, right? Hating sin, or hating homosexuality, or whatever. But also when you talk about God loving, God having love for us, all of these are ultimately human qualities that are not befitting of God. And Kant says that at the end of the day, when you think God at all in sensual terms, along concepts that you get from sensuality, that you get through experience, whether it's the experience of the outer world, like of the human body, or whether it's experience of the inner world, like the feelings you have of love, of hate, or whatever. Anything that is sensual is limited. Anything that is sensual is necessarily spatial and or temporal. I talked about this in my lecture on sensuality and on time and space as forms of viewing. So if you give God any predicate that is related to time or space in any sense, then you're already anthropomorphizing God. And this subtle anthropomorphism is much more dangerous to Kant. According to him, it destroys proper religion. It leads to paganism. And I will give a later lecture what is religion, what is paganism to Kant. To him, paganism does not mean having many gods, or does not mean crude anthropomorphism, so having a statue of God in human form or whatever, but rather it means believing in a human-like God, believing in a limited God, believing in a God who is anything but holy and who cares about anything but our morality. But I will explain that further in another lecture. So, if you give any central predicates at all to God, you already are committing at least subtle anthropomorphism. And this leads directly to paganism and thereby ruins religion. And not only religion, that's the whole point for Kant. If you have this paganism, you are ruining your morality. You are thinking of a non-moral or even immoral God that probably doesn't care about you being moral or even commands you to do immoral things, right? If you say God hates the homosexuals, then maybe he commands you to kill them, right? And Kant says it's better to be a skeptical atheist. That's what nowadays would be called an agnostic. I will discuss that in a later lecture, what Kant has to say about atheism. But basically, to him, there's the dogmatic atheist that outright denies God, and there's the skeptic atheist that just says, well, I don't believe in God, but I'm not completely ruling out that there is a God. So nowadays, that would be called an agnostic. And Kant says, being a skeptical atheist can go along with morality, but being a pagan, so being someone who anthropomorphizes God, that cannot go along with morality. To Kant, this anthropomorphism is a wrong theology. That in itself would not be such an issue if it was only a speculative error. Right? I discussed that in my last lecture on what is theology already. That to Kant, mere speculation, so thinking with our reason about questions where whatever the truth is doesn't really have any influence on our actions. Mere speculation is not so important for religion. Kant even stresses that you should not treat someone as a heretic, that you should not say someone has the wrong religion just because they have wrong opinions about God. So anthropomorphism, if it's just a speculative error of theology, is not an issue for Kant. But again, the issue is that it leads to wrong religion, to wrong actions, to immoral actions. While, again, skeptical atheism, agnosticism doesn't necessarily. So for that reason, the almost most important task of theology is to avoid anthropomorphism. Now, for this reason, deep thinkers, and particularly the mystics, at least since late antiquity and the Neoplatonism of late antiquity, have often favored what has been called negative theology, or also apophatic theology. This is a theology that says we cannot give positive statements about God. We cannot know what God is in himself or for himself. we can only talk about God in negative statements. We can only say what he is not. So we cannot really say that God loves us, because love in the human sense is not something befitting of God, right? God does not feel in the same sense we have. I mean, this would also mean that he would suffer when we suffer, right? That's what you do when you love someone. And that would not be befitting of God, who is completely blessed and felicious. So you cannot say that God loves us, but you can say in a negative statement that God does not hate us. Likewise, you cannot say that God is wise, because again, human wisdom is completely different from whatever God may be. But you can say at least that God is not foolish. You cannot say that God is all-knowing, but you can say at least that God is not ignorant. So you can only deny what God isn't, but you cannot make any positive statements about God. Now, this negative theology, I think, would indeed be most in line with Kant's philosophy of transcendental idealism. But that is, I have discussed in its own lecture on transcendental idealism. But basically, it means that Kant says we can only know the appearances, the things as they appear to us. We cannot know, or the phenomena as he calls them, we cannot know the noumena, the things in themselves. And the thing in itself, or the noumenon, to Kant is precisely a negative concept, a negative idea, or also a limited one that limits our thinking, one that lets us understand that what we do know and experience are not things in themselves, are just appearances. And Kant does say that the thing in itself can only be discussed in a negative sense. So we can only say it is not an appearance. It is not sensual. Therefore, it is not temporal or spatial. But what it is, we cannot say. Well, and the thing in itself, of course, is God, or God is a noumena, is a thing in itself. So it would make sense for Kant to do negative theology. Nevertheless, this is in fact not what Kant does. Kant does say that a sort of positive theology that does talk positively about God is possible. We just have to do it the right way. And according to Kant, there are 3 ways this can be done. However, these 3 ways are not 3 alternatives where you would have to pick one. Rather, these 3 have to be combined because they complete each other. And before I will explain each of these 3 ways, I want to point out that Kant did not come up with them. These are 3 classical ways, you could say, of doing theology that had been known and that had been described in theology long before Kant, and that even today, when you study some sort of Christian theology, you might learn about. So that's not original to Kant's thinking. But is, so to say, original might be A, what Kant has to say about them, how he describes them, and B, how Kant can fit them in his system with his architectonic method. And that is something very important to Kant, and that is something quite typical to his thinking. I already gave a lecture about the architectonic method. To Kant, it is this method that makes science. Because science to him is, and I also gave a lecture about what is science to Kant, it is systematic knowledge or systematic cognition. So The non-scientific, the common cognition, is rhapsodic. You have pieces of knowledge that are not systematically connected. And when a non-scientific thinker thinks about something, he would just come up with thoughts, or he would just look around at what he finds. So if you were to think about theology in a non-scientific, non-architectonic way, you would just contemplate, so to say, in what ways you could think about God. And maybe you would come up with one way, maybe you would come up with two ways, maybe you would come up with three ways to think about God. But you would never know if these are all the ways. Maybe you just came up with three ways, but maybe somewhere else could think of a fourth way that you didn't think of. Kant says in science we should always apply an architectonic method where we reduce the possibilities we have a priori, so before all experience, from a principle. So we use our reason, we deduce from a principle, and we find, so to say, the empty shelves that are there. We then still have to fill them, that's the further scientific work, but we already know how many shelves there are in total, or how they are structured, and therefore we already know what we have to look for. And the principle of reason that Kant uses for his architectonic is usually his table of categories. That is also something I already gave a lecture on that you might check out. Basically, Kant says our intellect has these 12 categories, these 12 basic concepts that are structured under 4 titles of 3 each. And these are pure concepts of our intellect. We don't take them from experience, but rather from the way our intellect works, from the nature of our intellect, so to say. And we have these 12 categories, and everything we could possibly think must be thought within the framework of these 12 categories and the 4 titles in which they are structured. And so therefore, whatever you may think of in a specific science can be structured a priori, before any experience, according to the structure of this table of categories. And this also goes for the ways you can think about God. And well, the 4 titles, the 4 groups in the table of categories are the categories of quantity, of quality, of relation, and of modality. And based on these, you will find that the 3 ways to do theology are, you could say, a quantitative, a qualitative, and a relational way. So you give God certain predicates. These predicates are taken from your intellect or from your experience, and therefore they are limited. They are probably essential. They anthropomorphize God. But then you do something with these predicates. You change their quantity in a way, you change their quality in a way, or you think of their relation in a specific way. And that's how you get closer to God. The 4th group of categories, the categories of modality, they don't get, so to say, their own way of doing theology, because the categories of modality are possibility, existence, and necessity, and their opposites. And so all you could do here with the predicates you give to God is asking, does God have this attribute possibly, actually, or necessarily? And of course the answer would always be necessarily, right? Every attribute, every predicate God has cannot just be his by accident, because then it would have to be caused by something outside God, and then God would not be absolute, but rather any predicate he has is necessarily his predicate. So these categories of modality, they don't offer us much, so to say, when it comes to thinking about God. But the other three groups of categories do. And so we have three ways, but we also know a priori that we can't have more ways to think about God. Of these, the first way is called via eminentiae, so the way of eminence. And this one is connected to quantity, because what you do here is you give God certain predicates that also a human being maybe could have. But in order to not think of God as just like a human being, what you do is you increase these predicates in degree, so to say, to the highest possible degree, to something absolute, so that they are more befitting of God. So, for example, we know what power is. We know this from experience, right? In the world, we experience power. We have power, other people have power, some have more power, some have very little power. So now we can take this predicate and we can say, okay, God also has power. But now we employ this via eminentiae, and we say, unlike human beings, God doesn't just have some limited power, but rather he is all powerful. So we, in our thoughts, increase the degree of power. Likewise, we know what knowledge is, what it means to know. And now we say, okay, God also has knowledge. But now, again, we use the via eminentiae and we increase this predicate and come to the conclusion that God is all-knowing. Or last example, we can say that everything that exists in the world has presence. So it exists in a specific space where it is present. But of course, the present, even of the largest thing, even of a large body like a star, is limited. Well, we increase this concept and say that God has omnipresence, that his presence is not limited. We mustn't, however, only employ the via eminentiae, Kant stresses, because if you take up sensual human predicates and you just increase their degree, then you are also inevitably increasing whatever is human and limited and imperfect about them. So inevitably you will anthropomorphize God. You will think of God as just a sort of very powerful, very eminent, as the name of the way suggests, human being. Which, as a side note, is what Feuerbach claims we did, right? Feuerbach, the young Hegelian who was influential on Marx and Engels later, he claims that humans came to their idea of God by just thinking of themselves, of human beings, and just sort of increasing the concept they had of themselves. So thinking of God as a very powerful and knowledgeable and so on human being. So in other words, he claims that human beings created God in their image. Kant would not say that this is true for the idea of God as such, but he would agree that this is what human beings often do. And this is, of course, an unaufklärdnis. The unaufkläred person is always defined by not leading himself, but being led, and most of all being led by his own sensuality, by what he experiences. The unaufkläred person, since he cannot think for himself, cannot abstract from his experience, from what he sees or hears or whatever. And therefore, he's necessarily an egocentric person. He only really knows his self, his ego, and projects that onto everything else, even onto God. And this is what lots of people do when they think about God. And not just what the believers do. This is also what many unbelievers, many atheists do. For example, I have often heard people say something along those lines. If there was a God, if there was an all-powerful master and creator of the universe, such a being would not even care about us. We would be too far removed, too small, too insignificant for this being. I've also heard that used by atheists as an argument against certain fundamentalists with their fundamentalist commandments, like when these people will claim, oh, God will condemn you to hell if you have sex before marriage, or if you have gay sex or whatever. Then someone might respond with, why should God, who is so great, so absolute, care about what we do in our bedrooms? That is far, far beneath God. But this means thinking God in human terms. It's as if you're saying the distance between God and us is like the distance between us and an ant, or even between us and a single cell organism, or even bigger. But like the distance between us and something very, very small. And to be sure, for us, a single cell organism is so tiny, so insignificant that in our daily lives we don't even think about it usually. And we certainly don't care about what the millions of single cell organisms that might live in our own home or even in our own body, what they are up to. And it would indeed be ridiculous if these single cell organisms thought that we cared about what they do and that we have given them commandments for how to do cell division. They are simply too small to matter for us. But the issue is, there is no distance between us and God. God is as close to the tiniest atom or the tiniest electron even as he is to the largest star. Therein, Kant would say, precisely lies God's dignity and God being absolute, that nothing is far removed for him, and that he can care about everything equally. I mean, if you say we are too small to matter for God, then you're saying God is limited, right? For us, since we are limited beings, only the things in our horizon matter. What is too big for us, like, I don't know, far away galaxies, or what is too small for us, like the single cell organism, since we are limited, this goes beyond our scope. This is not within our horizon. But God does not have a finite horizon. Everything is equally close to him, and he can take an equal interest in everything. So here you see how just using the via eminentiae leads to thinking of God as very great, very sublime, and so on, but still in his quality, not in his quantity, not in degree, but in his quality, human-like. This is also where you get some of the dumbest arguments against God, right? We all probably know these kinds of arguments that float around the internet, that get used by these enlightened atheist types, that are, well, probably used by people who think of themselves very smart, but really they are just in puberty or have never left puberty. Like these types of arguments, as someone says, oh, if God is all powerful, then can he create a stone that is so heavy that he can't lift it? Or can he create a fried chicken that is so hot that he can't eat it, or whatever? And they might think they are very clever and they've refuted God because they've shown that the very concept of being all powerful is self-contradictory, right? Because they would claim if God is all powerful, then he must be able to lift everything, every stone, no matter how heavy. But at the same time, if he's all powerful, he must be able to create everything, to create even a stone too heavy for himself, but not both can be the case, right? But here, what you're doing is, again, you're thinking of God in human terms. You are anthropomorphizing God. You are thinking of God as a human weightlifter. So, as someone who has strength, and of course, again, you increase the degree of the predicate. So you think of God as having vastly more strength than any human could ever have, but still, you think of someone having strength. And with his strength, picking up and lifting up some weight. So something that exists outside of him and that exists independently of him, and therefore that resists him, therefore that requires him to employ his strength to move it despite its resistance, right? And then, of course, with such a human weightlifter, you can always imagine him reaching his limit, him being faced with a weight that is too heavy for him to lift. But this is a completely stupid way to think about God. Kant calls such reasoning presumptuous and foolish frivolity. And he says, first, before starting to think about God or starting to make claims about God, you should first think about how could you even speak of God in a dignified way, in a way that is worthy of the idea of God. And in the case of God's omnipotence, Kant says this does not describe the relation between God and things outside of God, right? Saying this is what power, was potency means for us, right? For us, we find ourselves in a world amidst a nature that is not part of us, that resists us. And then we try to deal with this nature, right? We try to lift something up that through its heaviness resists us. Or we try to punch a hole through something that through its solidity resists us. And depending how powerful we are, how strong we are, we can overcome more or less resistance. So to us, power means our relation to something that is not we, and that therefore is not fully under our command, that therefore resists us, and how much can we subjugate this to our will. But that is not what omnipotence, when we ascribe it to God, should describe, Kant says. Rather, it describes the originating of everything in God and through God, right? The stone and everything else comes from God, is created by God. In that way, he's all-powerful. And Kant says, if you claim that God cannot make the impossible possible, that's what you're doing when, for example, you're saying God cannot create a stone so heavy that even he, with his omnipotence, cannot lift it. When you claim God cannot make the impossible possible, you have really said nothing, and you have not understood your own concepts you are using, Kant says, because this does not make sense. If you say that something can be made possible, then by definition it was never impossible. On the other hand, if something is truly impossible, then by definition, of course, it cannot be made possible. But this is not in spite of God. This doesn't say, okay, here God's power ends. The impossible thing resists him. He cannot make it possible. But rather, Kant says this is because of God. Because, and this is an important point to Kant, of Kant's idea of God, and I have talked about this already in my lecture on rational theology. To Kant, God is not just the origin of that which exists, but even of that which is possible, right? Many people would imagine possibility existing outside of God or independently of God or previous to God, right? As if, let's say, before the creation of the world, there was a number of possible worlds that could have been created, and God talked about these, and out of all these possible worlds, he picked which one would become the actual world, which one would be created, and he could also have actualized another possible world. But the possibilities themselves, as possibilities, were not created by God, but existed outside of God. In that case, God would not be the highest being, but rather God himself would be subject to the rules of logic. But that's not how Kant thinks of God. Rather, he thinks of God as, yes, having created the actual world, so being the originator of that which actually exists, but also being the originator even of the possibilities. What actually exists, God created through his will, his active will, and what could exist is dependent on God's being. So the rules of logic, they don't exist outside of God and rule God, with him not being able to overstep them. Rather, they too exist because of God and out of God's own being. They are part of his essence, so to say. But anyways, so you see that via eminentiae leads to problems, because again, it makes God be different from us only in degree, but not in quality. That is why, second, there is the via negationis, or also sometimes called via reductionis. This way of thinking about God is connected to the categories of quality. So here we are not just increasing the degree of a predicate that we give to God, but rather we are changing its quality, so that it is different from the predicates that we as human beings have. And the categories of quality are, of course, relation, negation, and limitation. Again, I discussed all that in detail in my lecture on the table of categories. And here it is specifically the category of negation that matters to us. Hence the name, right? Via negationis or reductionis. Because Kant says what we do here is we give a predicate to God, And then we negate all aspects of that predicate that are essential, that are limited. Or we reduce this predicate, you could say, to only the parts that are befitting of God. So you are sort of subtracting from God everything essential that does not belong with him. Let's go through some examples to better understand that. So, for example, when you say that God is eternal, what are you doing really? Well, first, you have a concept of duration, of existing from a specific point in time to another point in time. And this concept is something you know from experience also, right? You experience duration in life. You know that everything that surrounds you and that also you yourself exist for a certain duration of time. Some things exist for seconds, some things exist for billions of years, but they all have their duration. Now, you give this predicate to God, and now you can employ first the via eminentiae. You can increase this concept of duration and say that God exists not just for a limited time, not even for a long but still limited period of time, like billions of years, but rather that God exists in all time. But if you only use the via eminentiae, you still think of God as existing within time, even though within all the time. So now you use the via negationis for this predicate of absolute duration, and you subtract what is essential in it. You subtract time. And what you are left with is just necessary existence, right? That which has an absolute, never-ending duration exists in each point of time. And if you subtract time from that concept, what you are left with thinking is a thing that exists and that cannot possibly not exist, right? Again, never-ending duration would mean there is no point, no second in time where you don't exist. So if we take time away, what we are left with is existing necessarily and not ever not existing. And now you have God's eternity. So his eternity is not a temporal eternity, rather God is beyond all time. And this is quite important. This solves certain problems in theology. For example, there's one problem that has again and again come up in theology, which is how does God's omniscience, him being all-knowing, go together with our free will? Because if God knows everything, he knows what I will do, right? He knows, let's say that I will keep sitting here and keep talking to the camera for a while longer. But if that's the case, then that means I'm not free to stop sitting and talking here, right? Because if I were to stop and get up and leave, then I would do something that God did not foresee. And then God, in his knowledge that I would keep sitting and talking here, would have been wrong. So it seems that God being omniscient and me being free contradict each other. But they only do if you have not employed the via negationis. They only do if you think of God as still being in time. Because a being in time, even if it's a never-ending being that therefore exists in all time, has a present. And it has a past and it has a future. So that would mean that God always, just like we, only exists in the present second. Sure, he already existed previously, but that's over. And for him too, it's over, just like for me. For him too, the past is the past and is nothing but memory. Okay, God would probably have perfect memory. He would probably not forget a single detail from the past, but still it would be over and done for him. And likewise, of course, God will also exist in the future, just like me. And unlike me, he will not just exist in the next minute or the next year or the next decade, but in all the future, to be sure. But still, it is still the future for him. So it is still something for him, just like for me, that has not yet happened. And that he can only look forward to. That right now, he cannot experience, but rather only imagine. To be sure, since God is all-knowing, he knows what the future will bring, while I can only take guesses. But still, so the future would never surprise God. But still, it is something that is not yet there for him, just like it is not yet there for me. That is how you would think of God if you thought of him in temporal terms. And in that case, yes, then you have this problem of free will. Then my future actions, me either still sitting here or going away, will not have happened yet for God. And all he can do is foresee him and say what will happen. And yes, then we have the problem that if I do something that he didn't say will happen, then he was wrong. But if I cannot do something else than what he says will happen, then I'm not free. But if we use the via negationis, if we think of God's infinity as not existing in time, not even existing in time and never ending, but rather if we think of God being eternal in completely non-sensual, non-temporal terms, just in terms of God necessarily existing and not possibly not existing, then this is not a problem, because then for God there is no past, present, or future. For me there's a future. For me what I will do is in the future. But for God it's, so to say, as much in the present as my present is or as my past is. For him it's all one. So God doesn't know what I will do, in the sense that it has not happened yet for God, and he is as much waiting for it and anticipating it as I am. But rather, God simply knows me. He knows me fully. He knows my innermost nature, my very essence, and therefore also all my decisions. And for him, there is no difference between the decisions I made and the decisions I will do. He simply knows me. And only in this temporal world do my decisions appear as temporal, as one after the other. But amongst the things themselves, this is not the case. There, I am just as I am. Here it might be helpful to go back to my lecture on sensuality and on time and space as forms of viewing, because there I describe further that to Kant, well, time and space are how we view the world, how everything appears to us, but the things in themselves, like God, but also like our own soul, they are not in time and space. Just what appears to me appears as temporal and spatial. So this way, God being omniscient and me having free will, there's really no issue with that. Or at least Kant says it's no bigger issue than knowing any decisions of a being with free will, right? Now the question, how can God know what I will do in the future, and how can I still be free, is no more of a question than how can God know what I do in the present with me still being free. But let's take another example. Let's take God's will, right? But will is, again, we know from experience. We all have a will. We all want things. And of course, we can give this predicate to God and again employ the via eminentiae and think of God as having a greater will in degree than we have, a much more powerful will. So I don't always get what I want. Sometimes I want things, but they resist me and I don't get them. Well, God would always get what he wants, right? So God would never have unfulfilled wishes or anything. But still, that alone is not a proper way to think of God, because when we are thinking of will, of someone wanting something, then we are thinking of that person as having a lack, right? Lacking something and not being happy without that something. We think of that person as needing whatever he wants for his happiness, right? If I'm hungry and I want food, and my stomach grumbles, it means that I'm not happy. I'm only happy if I get the food, so I depend on the food. And even if I were to always get what I want, okay, then I would never end up unhappy. I would never want for anything. But still, the only reason I wouldn't be unhappy is because I get what I want, not because I don't need anything. So I would still be dependent on these things outside of me. And that is not befitting of God. So again, we need to, when we say God has a will, not just use the via eminentiae and say God's will is all powerful and he always gets what he wants, but also we need to employ the via negationis and take from the will anything that is essential, anything that is limited, namely this concept of a will as responding to or rising out of a lack and needing what he wants in order to be happy. Or as a last example, when we think of God as a substance, here too you can go back to my lecture on the table of categories, where I explained that amongst the categories of relation, the first is the category of substance and accident. Because in philosophy, in ontology, we think of everything that exists as either a substance or an accident of a substance. So the substance is, well, as the name suggests, it's that which subsists, a thing that exists on its own. And the accident is an attribute of a substance that cannot exist on its own. So, for example, my t-shirt is a substance and its accident is that it is red. You cannot have just redness in the world. You can have red only as an accident of something, of the t-shirt or the apple or the rose or whatever. It is clear that God is not merely an accident. God is not an attribute of another thing, but rather God is a substance. But then, usually, when we think of a substance, we think of it as something that is in space, probably, or at least in time, and that persists. Indeed, this is how we usually recognize something as a substance, Kant would say. This is, as he calls it, the schema of the substance by which we recognize a substance. But that means I explained further in my lecture on the schematism and the principles. So how do I know the t-shirt is a substance? Well, the accident can change, right? I can change the color of the t-shirt, I can dye it, and then it's not red any longer, it's blue. That's how I know that that the color was just an accident, but the t-shirt remains and is therefore a substance. The substance has a certain permanence, a certain duration in time. But again, that's not befitting of God. So we have to use the via negationis or reductionis. We have to take this away from our concept of a substance. And what are we left then with, Kant says? Well, a substance, if you take away the permanence, the duration in time, is just a power, a force, right? The substance is a certain force in the world that can bring forth other things, that can cause other things. Like the t-shirt causes me to see red when I look at it. And so God has to be thought of as a certain force that can cause other things. As I've said, only through this via negationis do we think of God not just as different from us in degree, but rather of a completely different quality than us, and of completely non-sensual, completely supersensual. Still, the via negationis alone also doesn't work, because if you only use the via negationis, there would be the danger of thinking of God as completely small and insignificant. Because think about it. If you say God has will, but now you take away from this will everything sensual, namely needing something, having some sort of lack that must be compensated, being dependent on the things you want, then you could also be left with thinking, okay, God has a self-sufficient will. God doesn't need anything because he's already content, and therefore God doesn't want anything. And therefore God also doesn't want to create a world, or doesn't want us to act in a certain manner. So you would end up with a will that, yes, is not depending on anything, does not need anything, but also doesn't want anything. Or likewise, if you think of God as a substance, and now you take away everything sensual from your concept of a substance. So you don't think of God as a material substance that has a certain extension in space, nor of him having a certain extension, a certain permanence in time. Okay, you are now left with the concept of just a force, but this could be very, very small, a very, very powerless force also. So small, so insignificant that it does not influence anything. So therefore, you mustn't use only the via negationis, you must also use the via eminentiae. You have to both increase the degree of the predicates you give to God and reduce them, negate all their sensual qualities in order to change their quality to something supersensual. So Kant says the via negationis must be the fundament for the via eminentiae. You must make sure that all attributes you give to God are thought of in a supersensual, not in a sensual manner. But this fundament alone is not everything. You also must increase, so to say, the degree of the attributes you give to God. But of course, these are not the only two ways of thinking about God. As I said, there's a third way left. And this usually gets called the via causalitas. And within Kant's architectonic, it's related to the third group of categories, the categories of relation. Should be obvious if you know about the table of categories, because causality is one of the three categories of relation, along with substance and with community. And when you use this way, you are not asking what is God, like what is God in himself or for himself. You don't want to understand God as such. Rather, you are asking what is God's relation to the world and therefore to us. What does he cause in the world, right? Hence the via causalitas. So what does he cause in us? So in other words, what is God's effect? And to understand the effect something has, you don't need to understand the thing in itself, right? I can see that something is poisonous. Like I can understand that everyone who eats this particular mushroom dies, without understanding how exactly that works, without analyzing the chemical properties of that thing. So in that sense, here we are asking not what is God as such, but rather what is God for us. And that's why Kant prefers this way. That's why to him, out of the three ways, it's the best, it's the most proper of thinking about God. Because Kant makes a distinction between theology and theosophy. Theosophy, which was in the 18th century also certain mystical school, you could say, right? Like there were theosophists who were mystics that were claiming to have visions of God or of heaven, that wanted to reach God and understand God through their visions. And to Kant, theosophy, which comes from, right, theos is God, of course, just like in theology, but then Sophia is wisdom, like in philosophy, the love for wisdom. So theosophy would be the wisdom of God, while theology would be just the doctrine or the teaching of God. And to Kant, theosophy would mean truly understanding God, truly having cognition of God as he is in himself and to himself. And to Kant, theosophy is not possible. It is presumptuous raving to want to do theosophy. But not only is it not possible, it's also not necessary, Kant says. What do we need to understand God himself for? It is perfectly sufficient for us in this physical life here, in this plane of existence, to know what God is for us, how God influences us, or what God wants from us. So we don't need theosophy. Theology is perfectly fine, Kant says. And if you don't want to do theosophy, and if you don't think that you are doing theosophy, then a certain kind of anthropomorphism is actually okay, Kant says. Because now you are not trying to understand what God is in himself. So when you give God human-like predicates, you are not claiming that this is really how God is, and that, so to say, if God were to look at himself and speak to himself, he would describe himself in these human-like terms. But rather, you are only using these by way of analogy. And this is also why Kant prefers to call this third way of understanding God not via causalitas, as it has traditionally often been called, but rather the via analogiae, because he says analogy is what you are doing here. Now, I already talked about what analogy means to Kant in my lecture on what is science. I think I accidentally said allegory there a number of times, but of course what I meant is analogy. I said there that to Kant empirical cognition can work by way of induction or by way of analogy. And what does analogy mean? Well, in an analogy, you're talking about a certain resemblance, right? You're saying that something resembles something else. But what is important to Kant is that this is not an imperfect resemblance between two things, right? Like when I say, okay, a carrot is kind of like a cucumber. Here I'm comparing the things because I'm saying, okay, both is food, both is a vegetable, both is kind of long and thin, so they resemble one another, but of course it's an imperfect resemblance because there's differences. One is green, one is orange. No, Kant says an analogy is not an imperfect resemblance, it's a perfect resemblance. What I'm comparing is not just kind of alike, it's identical, but the resemblance, the perfect resemblance, is not between things, but between relations of things. So in an analogy, Kant says, I have an A that I know and a B that I also know, and A has a certain relation to B. And then I have a C that I know, and then I have an X that I don't know, and C has a relation to X. And what I'm claiming is not that A is perfectly resembling C, nor that B is perfectly resembling X. I don't know X at all. I don't know what it looks like, if it looks anything like B. And I do know A and C, and I know that they don't perfectly look the same. But what I am saying is that the relationship that A has to B is akin to the relationship that C has to X, right? So an analogy in Kant's sense would be, let's say, if I claim the captain is to his ship like the king is to his state. By that, I'm not saying that A, the captain, is like C, the king. And I'm also not saying that B, the ship, is like X, the state. A captain may have nothing to do with a king, and a ship may have even less to do with a state. But what I am saying is that the relationship that a captain has to his ship, that is similar to the relationship that the king has to his state. However dissimilar the captain and the king or the ship and the state might be. You can maybe understand this well if you think of mathematics. To Kant, there are two basic signs. I explained that in my lecture, what is philosophy? To him, there's mathematics, and there's philosophy in the broadest possible sense, which includes not just metaphysics, but also natural science. And both sometimes work with analogies. The analogies of mathematics, however, are quantitative analogies, Kant says. So they are analogies of proportion. You are saying that the proportion of something is analogous to something else. So if, for example, I say that 8 has the same relation to 4 that x has to 50. What I'm saying is that the proportion between 8 and 4, 8 being double what 4 is the same as that between x and 50, meaning x is 2 times 50, which would mean that it is 100, right? I'm not claiming by this that 8 is anything like x, like 100 in this case, nor am I claiming that 4 has anything to do with 50. I'm just saying the same relation, the same proportion we have between 8 and 4, one being double the other, is what we have between x and 50. Well, Kant says, in philosophy, including natural science, we can also use analogies. But these now are not analogies of quantity, of proportion, but rather they are analogies of relation, of causality, saying that one thing has the same causal relationship to another thing as a third thing has to a fourth thing. And this is how we can talk about God, and how we can even use anthropomorphic predicates for God without much danger. So when I say that God loves us, for example, we mustn't understand this literally. God does not literally love us, because love is something sensual, love is something human beings feel. God doesn't feel in that way. And it would not be fitting of God to claim that he does, right? Because, again, if you love, it means that you want to be close maybe to the one you love, and you maybe suffer if you aren't close. Or maybe you suffer if your loved one is unhappy. Since there are always many human beings that are unhappy, that are miserable, that are suffering on this world, if God loved us in a human way, that would mean he's constantly suffering. He would have to constantly be sad and miserable for all the pain on earth, and that would not be fit God's perfection. So clearly God does not love us. But if I use the via analogiae, then I can say, just as A, which I know, love, is to B, which I also know, the loved one, so X, which I don't know, God's whatever, we are calling it love because we don't have a better word for it, is to C, to humanity. Meaning, God doesn't love us in the same way, God doesn't feel love, but God treats us like a person who loves would treat the person that he loves. So the relation is the same. Same with hate. It would be even less befitting to say that God hates, right? To say God hates the sin. Because hate is not a very nice feeling. No one enjoys hating. So God would not be happy if he had to constantly hate. This would not fit with God's blessedness. But I can say that there is an analogy to hate. Just like he who hates treats that which he hates, so God treats sin. He probably does not feel burning hate that eats away at his heart and that makes him feel miserable, but he still treats the sin as if he hated it. Just like someone who loves a person, cares for that person, helps that person, wants what's best for that person, so God treats us. Just like someone who loves something would turn away from that something in disgust or would fight that something, so God treats sin. And this is how we can speak of God in analogy. So, for example, when we say God is the creator, we don't understand what that means truly. Because we know of creating only in the sense of reshaping, right? The sculpturer gives the stone a new form, but the stone was already there. We don't understand how something could be created out of nothing. So we cannot understand God as the creator as such, but we can say, by way of analogy, that God is like the clockmaker making a clock, or that God is like a builder building a house, saying he has the same relation to the world as the clockmaker to the clock, or as the builder to the house. And again, in this sense, anthropomorphism is fine. We can speak of God in human-like terms because we don't mean it that way. It's just a manner of speaking. Here Kant distinguishes and says anthropomorphism could be symbolic anthropomorphism, or it could be dogmatic anthropomorphism. It could be an anthropomorphism of speech, where you just speak in anthropomorphic terms, or it could be an anthropomorphism of the object, where you actually think that the object is this way you are describing it. The former, to use two terms that Kant often uses in his philosophy, the former, the anthropomorphism of speech that is just symbolic, is only regulative. It just regulates our thinking. Only the latter, the dogmatic anthropomorphism of the object, would be constitutive, actually claiming to describe the thing. And the former is not a problem, this symbolic anthropomorphism of speech. That's not just when it comes to God, right? That's also when we talk about other things, like nature, for example. Like when we describe certain things in nature, especially in biology, we may say something like this is well made, or this is well planned by nature, or nature gave this animal thick fur because it lives in a cold area, or whatever. Or maybe not nature, maybe nowadays we will say evolution did that, right? Evolution made this animal white because it lives in the snow. But usually when people talk like that, they are very well aware that nature, or that evolution, is not a person with consciousness that planned for this. So it's just a manner of speaking, a symbolic way of speaking. And as long as we are aware of that, as long as we don't take this literally, then there's nothing wrong with that, Kant says. It just would be, he says, childish to actually take the symbol as more than just a symbol. And here you should note that Kant compares this symbolic anthropomorphism when it comes to God with the schematism of our power of judgment. What that is, I already discussed in its own lecture, but simply put, Kant says we have these 12 categories, these 12 pure concepts of our intellect, by which we are thinking and by which we are experiencing. But, he says, since they are pure concepts without any sensuality, we cannot work with them as such. We cannot understand, we cannot know, does anything exist for which this concept fits? And we can also not understand, even if such a thing existed, how could we recognize it as such? What we need is to give those concepts a schema, a sensual schema, which in the case of those concepts is time. So let me give two examples. We have the concept of substance. How is it defined? If we just go by the concept without any any sensuality, well, then we would just say a substance, as opposed to an accident, is that which exists not just as an attribute of something else, but rather which exists by itself. Okay. But from this is what I'm thinking when I'm thinking of a substance. But from this thought, I neither know, does such a thing even exist? I mean, maybe there are no substances. I can think of something which exists not as another thing's attribute, but maybe there is no such thing. And second, even if it did exist, how would I recognize a substance? How would I recognize that this is not an attribute of another thing? Well, Kant says, through the temporal schema of permanence. I already said it, right? My t-shirt is a substance. The red color is not, because I can dye my t-shirt. So the accidents, the colors can change, but the t-shirt as such remains. And therefore, I know that it exists on itself and not as an attribute of something else. Therefore, it is a substance. As a second example, take the concept of causality. If you just go with the definition, independent of all sensuality, then causality means that with one thing, A, posited, another thing, B, is also necessarily posited. If A exists, then B exists. But again, you don't know if you are just thinking of this concept, abstracting from all sensuality, you would not know if something like causality even exists. I mean, it's one thing to think of something like that, to think, okay, the existence of one thing A makes the existence of another thing B necessary. But maybe there is no such connection between two things ever in real life. And also, even if there was such a thing as causality, how would we know? How would we ever know that this B exists only because A exists? Well, again, you use time as a schema to schematize your concept of causality. So what Kant says is, in experience, we know causality to be there when A is always followed by B necessarily in time. So if every time A happens first, then B happens after, then we know that B was caused by A, right? If every time the one billiard ball rolls against the second one starts rolling away, then we know it was caused by the first one. If sometimes B comes before A, or if sometimes A happens and then afterwards in time B does not happen, then we know that there's no causality here, that B just sometimes followed A by accident, by coincidence. So what this means is to think our 12 categories, these concepts that our intellect has. We can think them, of course, without anything sensual mixed with that thought, but we cannot really work with that thought. In order to be able to work with it, in order to, so to say, use these concepts for experience, we need the schemata. We need something sensual. And the same now in a way is true for God. Kant says God as such, of course, would be an abstract idea, a pure thought with nothing sensual, nothing empirical mixed in. But such a thing we could not really grasp. So we might use the symbolic anthropomorphism. We might describe gods in human-like terms, as loving us, as hating sin, as knowing or having power or whatever. in order to schematize the idea of God, in order to be able to better think it and to better use it for our thinking. But we must just be aware that this is only a symbolic manner of speaking, that we are only speaking by way of analogy. We must never let this become a dogmatic anthropomorphism, where we actually believe that this is how God truly is. And I would claim that this symbolic anthropomorphism is also how holy texts often speak. And you would have to be pretty stupid. You would have to be an especially close-minded fundamentalist to take these texts literally and to not understand that this is a symbolic or an analogous manner of describing God. I mean, think of the Bible, think of the New Testament, for example, where John says of Jesus, "Behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world." I think that not even the most literalist Bible reader would claim that Jesus was a sheep, that the disciples were following a sheep and that the Romans nailed a sheep to the cross. No, it's pretty obvious that this is a symbolic manner of speaking, right? That this is an analogy. Jesus is like the lamb, innocent like the lamb, getting sacrificed like the lamb. Or likewise, when you look at the Old Testament, read, for example, what Isaiah has to say about how God feels about the sacrifices. "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, says the Lord? I am full of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fat beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of lambs or of he-goats. When ye come to appear before me, who hath required this at your hand, to tread my courts? Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting." Are we to believe that God is really disgusted by all the blood, by the smell of the smoke of the burnt sacrifices? No, we are to believe that God acts towards us in the same manner as someone who would be disgusted by it would, namely turning away, namely not wanting, not liking these sacrifices. So it is pretty clear to me that this symbolic anthropomorphism is what is often used when speaking about God. And again, to Kant, this third way, this via analogiae, is the best way to do theology, to talk about God. It's also the most humble way in a way. You're not asking to know God to do theosophy. You're just asking to know what is God to you. How does he relate to you? And that is all we really need to know. But anyways, this is how you do rational theology according to Kant. But then he also talks about what types of rational theology there are, because to him there are, you could say, various subfields of rational theology. All of them work with the same methods, namely with these three ways: the via eminentiae, that increases the predicates in their quantity, the via negationis, that changes their quality by subtracting everything sensual, and the via analogiae, that speaks in anthropomorphic terms of God, but only in a symbolic way, that asks not what he is in himself, but what he is for us, that describes him by way of analogy. But while you always use these same methods, you do these in different ways or in different areas. Namely, Kant says there's a theoretical and there's a practical theology. The theoretical theology is speculative. Meaning, here you think about God and about what is God's essence, and you try to prove God. So Kant shows that all the attempted proofs for God fail. That's one of the important results of his critique of pure reason. But even if they were not to fail, even if these proofs for God would work, this would still all be speculative in the sense that it would not have much influence on our action. The concept of God that merely theoretical, speculative theology leads to is a God that does not really want anything from us, or at least we don't know what he wants from us, and so therefore it cannot influence our actions. These questions might be interesting for our curiosity, but ultimately the answers, one way or another, don't matter that much. The practical theology, on the other hand, is moral theology. So here you do learn what God wants from you, and you learn that God wants you to be moral, that God wants you to be a good person, to love your neighbor, for example. And this practical theology does not have a proof for God per se, but it offers us a rational reason to believe in God. With that said, while Kant would say that of these two kinds, the practical theology is what really matters in the end, he does not completely dismiss the theoretical, merely speculative theology. Because he does say it serves a negative function. It can prevent us from having certain wrong views about God, about what is God's nature, about what God might want. Most of all, it prevents us from anthropomorphism, be it crude or be it subtle anthropomorphism. And therefore, it can prevent prejudices about God. It can prevent us from having religious delusions like superstition, like raving. And therefore, it can be very helpful for the practical, for the moral theology, so we don't get lost, so we don't end up with actually having an immoral idea of God. And so therefore, Kant would say the theoretical, the speculative theology as such doesn't really lead to anything. It cannot prove its concept of God, nor does this concept of God work as a fundament for religion, for acting. But it is still an important fundament because it prevents us from having wrong thoughts, wrong concepts of God. And therefore it can be a good fundament, therefore it can carry the moral, the practical theology. There's further subdivisions also that Kant makes when it comes to the theoretical, the speculative theology. Namely, there is transcendental theology, which in turn can be separated into ontotheology and cosmotheology. And then along with the transcendental theology, there is physicotheology, which together with the practical, the moral theology forms natural theology. All of these I will discuss separately. All of these I will discuss in their own lectures. So therefore I will not further explain what they are, what differentiates them. I just want to point out one last thing, and that is once again Kant's architectonic method. Because these various kinds of theology they are not random. It's not that Kant says, oh, okay, there's ontotheology and cosmo and physico and moral theology, and maybe there could also be more that I didn't think of. But rather, he says that these are all possible forms of rational theology there are. He says there are only a limited number of possible proofs for God. Only 3 proofs: the ontological, the cosmological, and the physico-theological argument for God. And then along with those, there's the moral argument for God that doesn't prove him as such, but gives a reason to believe in him. And all of these, they attempt to prove God. Again, he shows how these proofs fail, but still they are attempted proofs of our reason for God. But all of these don't prove the same God. Rather, all of these different proofs lead to a slightly different concept of God. We are proving 3 different gods here. 3 because the ontological proof and the cosmological proof, they are both transcendental, right? Ontotheology and cosmotheology both belong to transcendental theology and are quite similar. So we have the transcendental proof of God, the physico-theological proof of God, and the moral proof of God, all leading to a different idea of God, to the God of the philosophers, the God of nature, and the God of freedom, you could say. And therefore, they also all lead to different fields of theology. And there cannot be more. And if you ask, how does Kant arrive at these various fields? Through his architectonic method, namely, what is the principle from which this is deduced? Kant himself doesn't necessarily outright say it so much, but I would say we can note 2 things here, 2 principles. One, if you go back to my lecture on what is metaphysics, there I explained the various fields of metaphysics, of science that there are according to Kant, and also how he deduces them. And if you compare them to the fields of theology, you will find that every field of science leads to its own proof of God and therefore to its own theology, right? Because Kant says there is theoretical and there's practical philosophy being moral philosophy. Well, and now he says there's a moral proof for God and a moral theology. And then within theoretical philosophy, Kant says there is physics or natural science. That is where we get the physico-theological proof for God that tries to prove God out of nature. Then there is cosmology that looks at the world as a whole. And that is obviously where we get the cosmological proof for God and the cosmotheology. And there's ontology, which examines being as such and the basic predicates of everything that is. Not specific to what it is, but simply everything that is. And this ontology leads to the ontological proof for God and the ontotheology. Rational theology itself is one of the fields of metaphysics to Kant. And we find that this field sort of uses all the other fields of metaphysics to its own aim, to understanding God. We find that all the other fields of metaphysics, cosmology, ontology, physics, morality or moral philosophy, all offer their own proof and therefore their own concept of God to rational theology. The only one that is excluded is rational psychology, where we think about the soul, the nature of the soul, there is no psychological proof for God, and there's no psychotheology for Kant. Which should be clear, because here we are just dealing with our own soul. This cannot lead us to go out of our soul to prove anything that is outside of us. So this would be one way through the architectonic method of arriving at these different types of theology. If we look more specifically at the proofs for God, we can also find that they correspond to our three faculties of thinking. As I explained in various previous lectures, Kant says our thinking faculty is threefold. There's the intellect, there's the power of judgment, and there's reason. Each of these three I have given its own lecture where I further explain it. Here all I want to say is that each of these three produces one proof for God. The intellect is the faculty of concepts or of rules. It lets us think and thereby understand things. And this leads to the transcendental proofs for God, both the ontological and the cosmological, because Kant shows that they are really quite similar and that they are really one and the same at the end of the day. Because here you are just thinking. You're thinking God with your intellect, and the proof just claims that the very thought of God already proves God. That God is thought of as the necessary being, and therefore, since necessity is part of this concept, is part of its attributes, God must exist. Second, the power of judgment, well, it makes judgments. And as I explained in my lecture on the power of judgment, it has this concept of purposiveness. It can judge for things to have a purposive form, a form that serves a purpose well, and therefore can be understood well by the power of judgment. And this leads us to the physico-theological proof for God, because here we are looking at nature, and our power of judgment finds nature, in particular living nature, biological nature, to be very purposive. It's not just utter chaos, but rather it looks as if a conscious, rational architect had formed this nature. And this we use as an attempted proof for God. And largely we have reason, which is the faculty of principles. And this includes moral principles. Reason, in large parts, to Kant is a practical faculty. That's a big point of Kant's philosophy, that he showed in his moral philosophy, in his critique of practical reason, that reason is not just theoretical, not just serving our understanding, but that there is such a thing as practical reason that tells us what to do. Well, and now he says that from the principles of reason, from the moral principles, it follows that there should be a God. Our morality that reason gives us, the moral demands, the moral duties that reason gives us, cannot be fully fulfilled, or at least they cannot have the results they should have if there is no God. Therefore, it is rational to believe in God. If you don't understand all of this now, that's not an issue, because again, I will give to each of these types of theology, and therefore also to each of these proofs for God, its own lecture where I will explain it further. Here, all I wanted to point out is that these are not random, that Kant doesn't just claim, oh, okay, there's 4 possible proofs of God, 2 of which are really the same, so it comes down to 3, and therefore there's 4 possible types of theology, and maybe other people could think of more. But rather Kant claims this is it. We can deduce from the metaphysical sciences there are, or from the thinking faculties we have, we can reduce that these are all the proofs, and therefore these are all the fields of theology there could ever be. And this is important. Kant himself says, after having disproven the three theoretical proofs for God, he says, please leave me alone with new attempts. I don't want to read of someone proposing a new proof for God. I don't want someone to come away from me having disproven these three proofs and now coming up with an improved argument for God. Because what Kant claims is, of course, there are various arguments for God. There are more than just three, but they are really just variations of these three basic kinds. If you break it down, it comes down to just three, plus the fourth, the moral argument that Kant himself proposes. And any new attempt could just be a rephrasing of one of these three arguments that Kant already disproved. Maybe a better rephrasing that makes it sound more convincing, maybe a slight improvement to the argument, but still nothing truly new or original. And therefore it can be dismissed without us having even to listen to it. And this, unfortunately, is a message that not everyone got, right? To this day, people still try to sometimes come up with new arguments for God. I mean, even here on YouTube, I've had videos suggested to me, a new argument for God that no one has heard before and that atheists have no answer to. And I did not click on that video. It really doesn't interest me at all what that person has to say, because I know a priori, before experience, before having listened, that this is bullshit. That this person has never read Kant, and that whatever sophistry that person came up with, it will come down to one of the same old three arguments that Kant already disproved. The same goes for the other side, by the way, for the atheists. I've also seen videos, a new argument against God. This argument completely destroys religion. And that video I also don't click on. Because no, you did not, 200 years after Kant, without ever even having read with, you did not suddenly come up with a new counter-argument against God that in over 2,000 years of history of philosophy, no one before you was ever clever enough to think of. No, you did not. You're just fooling yourself. And so, thanks to this architectonic, we can focus on what matters, and we don't have to get lost in ever new attempts to prove or disprove God. We can focus on the basic arguments there could be, and we know once we dealt with them, the topic is done. So, if you were to suggest a new fifth argument for God, if you claim to have such a thing, Kant would not want to listen to it. Rather, he would first, before he listens to it, ask you to talk about the condition of the possibility of such a fifth argument. You would first have to prove that such a fifth argument is even possible before Kant would be willing to examine your specific argument. So what you would have to do, essentially, if these arguments come from our three faculties of thinking, you would have to show that there's a fourth faculty of thinking that Kant didn't cover, along with the intellect, the power of judgment, and reason. If there was a fourth faculty of thinking, okay, it would make sense that this also has its own argument for God. But if there's not, I mean, an argument, you are thinking of the argument, so it must come out of one of your three faculties of thinking. So you would have to explain why the same faculty would be able to produce two entirely different arguments. When they come out of the same faculty that has the same nature, it stands to reason that essentially it's the same argument. Likewise with the fields of metaphysics, right? All the subfields of theology and all the arguments correspond to one of the fields of metaphysics. So if you were to come up with a supposed new argument, you would have to also show that there's another field of metaphysics that Kant didn't think of, that Kant didn't cover. I mean, the only alternative to this would be to dismiss the architectonic method altogether, to say that this doesn't work, that we cannot a priori deduce all the possibilities that there can be in a science. These are the two options you have. Either you accept Kant's architectonic method, but then if you want to claim there's more arguments than the ones Kant covered, you would have to show that there are more fields of metaphysics, or that there are more faculties of thinking than the ones Kant knew about. Or you would have to dismiss the architectonic method altogether. But of course, this mustn't be just mere dismissal because you don't like it. Rather, you would have to actually engage with Kant's arguments and actually disprove the architectonic method. But both disproving the architectonic method or accepting it, but showing that, let's say, there are more faculties of thinking, both usually isn't done. Because usually people don't engage with Kant properly, because their thinking is not systematic and therefore, in Kant's terms, not scientific, not philosophical, but just rhapsodic. And I hope this also goes to show the different level on which Kant is thinking, and on which many people, and not just random regular people, but even many so-called philosophers, even many professors at university are thinking. There's a whole different quality to their thinking, a whole different level of sophistication and of how systematic their thinking is. And many simply don't grasp this systematic aspect of Kant's thinking, because their own thinking is just chaos and rhapsody. They treat Kant's thinking as if it was the same, as if it was just a random bunch of arguments that you can engage with, that you can agree with or disagree with and try to disprove. But they don't acknowledge the fact that these arguments also have their place, and their necessary place, within a bigger framework. And you have to engage with the framework. You have to either agree with the framework or you have to disprove the framework. But you cannot just focus on specific arguments. That for me was very important to point out, also because it is pointed out way too rarely by way too few people. But with that, I'm done talking about rational theology as such. And now in the next lectures I give on Kant, I want to get into these various kinds of theology, into the transcendental theology with the ontological and cosmological argument, into the physical theology, and into the moral theology. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Jen Kubilai Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Kim Giamatti, Ellen Hansen, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.